everyone, welcome to the next episode of my science podcast. Today I'm really delighted to welcome Dr. Lenka Novak, who is a postdoctoral scholar in large-scale atmospheric dynamics in the Division of Geological and Planetary Sciences at Caltech. Her research focuses on mid-latitude storm tracks, and she works on idealized simulations of the global atmosphere to develop theoretical understanding for extreme weather under the current, past and future climates. So thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So to start off, may you tell us about your career so far?
So my career so far, I guess it started by moving to the UK when I was 14. At the time I had no idea what I wanted to do. But the education system in the UK is a little bit different. So as you know, at 16, I had to choose 3 of my favorite subjects and I had no clue. So I chose to do 3 different ones, which was geography, French and physics. So I kind of like humanities, but I also like science. And then when I came to going to university, I asked our career advisor, I said basically that, I don't want to lose the humanities side, but I still want to do science. And she said, well, why don't you do geography? Because that way you do a bit of science and a bit of humanities, and then you can basically delay the choice. And so I decided to apply to Durham University and go to do physical geography. And although that was a very fun and very good course, at the end, I felt like it was kind of a bit of both, which so my career advisor was right, but it didn't give me enough kind of foundations in science, because there wasn't that much maths, there wasn't that much physics. It was mainly this particular course was more about, was kind of like geology, geomorphology type stuff, which was very fun and very, very, very good for someone who wants to do that in the future. But I slowly realized that I wanted to do something more to do with the atmosphere. So there was one module that I did that was kind of more in the kind of global circulation direction. So that was a very kind of short introduction to climate dynamics for me. And that's when I realized I really liked that and I want to go into that. So at the time I had this dream to go to the Navy, but I realized that if you have to be a UK citizen to go to the Navy, or someone told me that. And so I was like, okay, I can't do that. Maybe one day, but I still had this dream of doing something to do with the ocean or the atmosphere. So I decided to apply for a PhD in meteorology at the University of Reading, which has a great reputation, has a huge program for meteorology PhDs. I think it's, at least at the time, was the only university which had an actual meteorology department. So other universities can also offer similar PhDs, but this was the only one which had a, specifically meteorology oriented department. So I did my PhD there. It was a bit of a change. Decided to kind of sway the other way. So going from kind of more qualitative science to more abstract and theoretical science. Just before I started, I remember going to my interview, and my future advisor said that he would normally prefer someone with, who did maths or physics, and he recommended to me that I learn A-level maths, because I never did A-level maths. I did physics. That was it. So I was kind of learning A-level maths and a bit of further maths over the summer before I started, trying to get up to speed. And then the steep curve carried on throughout the PhD, which was challenging but fun. And so, but I think one of the reasons why I wanted to do, well, there are two reasons why I wanted to do this particular PhD, which was centered on the large scale circulation of the atmosphere. So one is that I've always been fascinated by, satellite images of huge hurricanes and extratropical storms. And I wanted to know how they behaved, how they were formed, and, the theory behind it. So that was the kind of more curious factor. And the other one was, I think I kind of wanted to prove to myself that I can do the theory. So that's why I swayed so much to that side. And then when I finished the PhD, I was glad I've got it, but I realized that actually sometimes the papers I was writing were so abstract that even though, it was cool because you could see some similarity in the observed atmosphere, it didn't, I felt like I wanted my research to have more impact. So then when I finished my PhD, and I stayed on for a couple of years after that at Reading, and I spent some of that time applying for a fellowship. So a fellowship is like it's basically like a grant that you get for a couple of years or so, and you can do your own research. So it depends on the fellowship in question. This one was funded by an insurance company, and the focus of the topics was on impact. So I proposed that I would study these huge storms, windstorms in the atmosphere and their impact. And I got the fellowship in the end. And the advantage of this fellowship was that at the end of it, you would be very likely to be considered for a kind of permanent position at a university. So I had this kind of cushy path that I worked towards for several years. But then one day, one of my kind of I guess he wasn't a collaborator at the time, but this professor that I knew from conferences came to visit my department, and this was before I accepted this fellowship. And he asked me what I was doing, and I said I was applying for this fellowship. And he asked if I wanted to also have a backup plan and apply with him for a similar grant in the US. So at first I was a little bit overwhelmed. So I was like, oh, I don't know. I've never even considered moving out of the UK. I have this, grand plan. And then in the end I said, yeah, let's do it. It sounds great. So we applied and we got the funding. And then I found out I got the fellowship funding as well. So I was like, oh, which one should I choose? Because the two paths were very different. The fellowship in the UK would have been kind of carrying on what I was doing, but applying it and working kind of more or less on my own, maybe developing a small team of students. And the other option was a little bit more, there was more freedom, I guess, to just work on something related to my work, but it didn't have to be impact of windstorms. And it was in this team in Pasadena about whom I've heard great things. The professor, of course, I knew was one of the top people in the field. And so in the end, I decided to go for the Pasadena one and come to Caltech and do climate dynamics. And as I was working on this project, so this was a 3-year project, I was working alongside this team called Klima, which kind of came to being as I was doing this project. And this Klima project or group is developing a new climate model from scratch. Now, climate modeling has always been a bit of a kind of not difficult topic, but it's been, I think subconsciously, I always try to avoid it because it always had these political connotations. And whenever I went to conferences, the models, the talks about the different models seemed to, a lot of the time seemed quite obscure, and I always had more questions than after the talk than before the talk. So and it seemed like it's more statistics and not really looking at the mechanisms of how the climate system works. So I always so as I was working alongside this team and going to their talks, I was always kind of like, not, I was looking over, being impressed at what they do, and being surprised, just how fascinating climate science is. And then as of 2 weeks ago, I joined the team fully, because I guess it didn't take too much conviction to make me want to contribute to this amazing effort, to develop a new climate model that will hopefully address some of the issues with the current models that frustrated me in those talks those years ago. So
can you tell us a bit about this modelling, and how is it different from the old modelling?
Yeah, so classical climate modeling is basically, so a climate model is a combination of different components. So you have the atmospheric component, the oceanic component, land, some biosphere component, and they kind of stack together. And the models, as you can imagine, there are many ways in which you can represent this kind of coupling of different components. So that's one thing, that you have different models of the different components stacked together. So that's one aspect of the classical models. The other aspect is that so climate models in general can only simulate the climate system at a particular resolution, so at a cross resolution. So right now, with the computing capabilities we have, we can run climate simulations. That means simulations of the climate system for, say, 100 years at a resolution of 100 kilometers or 25 kilometers. And that's not enough to resolve all of the important processes. For example, clouds, which have spatial scales of 110 meters. So and that's just one example of a process which can't be resolved by these big models. And so we have to approximate these processes and represent them at the cause grid of 100 kilometers. And so you need to use it's called parameterizations. And parameterization is an approximation of a process. So you could think of it as an average behavior of that particular process over the one grid cell of a model. And so yes, so the parameterizations, all these approximations that the climate models have, are usually based on, well, first of all, you can have different ways of approximating, because it's not an exact thing. So different modeling groups choose different extents to which to be accurate. So they vary from, because of that, they also vary. They're also less accurate if in different conditions. So a lot of these approximations are based on, for example, field studies. So empirical field campaigns where they measured the atmospheric conditions over a particular field in a particular time. And so it's not all these approximations are not necessarily general enough for all of the regions of the atmosphere. And that leads to errors as well. another way in which climate models differ is the way they are represented in terms of the kind of so it's called numerics, which is the way you discretize the climate system into a grid. So to represent the data of the that you're trying to simulate, you have to, just like with an image, you have pixels, and so you kind of have a grid of in 2D. Well, with the it's similar with a kind of representation of in a climate model of data in a climate model, where the data is situated on a grid, and the sort of grid you use is has a great impact on the errors that you get from when you simulate the flow. And different modeling groups use different representations, so that also leads to differences in the climate models. And another reason, another feature of climate models is that they are very expensive to run. So it's difficult to run them enough times to get a good idea of their uncertainty. So what you're left with then, I think there are around 30 complex climate models in the last climate model assessment. And they vary a lot in the way they represent certain aspects. So I'm not saying that they are all kind of, that we shouldn't trust them, because they all agree in some aspects, but in some important aspects they differ. And because of all of these different factors I've just mentioned, sometimes it's difficult to disentangle the causes of the errors and to even know which ones we can trust. So just to give you an example, all of the climate models that have been kind of considered seriously for climate predictions agree that in the future we will experience some sort of warming. But the extent of warming is still unknown. So, for example, I think in the latest climate models, so it's called the CMIP6 models, you could, for doubling, if you were to double the amount of CO2 in the models and then measure how much global temperature increase you get, it ranges from just below 2 degrees to just above 5 degrees. So that is very, so it may not sound like a lot, but it may make a difference of, say, 40 years when we would reach the Paris Agreement. So that's linked to, what we need to do, how we need to adapt, how quickly we need to adapt, where we need to invest first. So so that was one of the reasons. The fact that there's so much spread in the models was one of the reasons why I was always a bit wary in working in the field. But then when there was this opportunity to work on something that addresses these issues, it was very motivating to go into it.
So later on, we'll talk about more on how we can stop, the impacts of climate change, how we can each do our bit to help this. But firstly, we'll talk about some of your earlier work. So may you expand upon how the North Atlantic eddy-driven jet works and the variability of the associated storm track? And you'll have to give a bit of an overview of what these are first.
Sounds good. Yes, so this is going back a little bit. So so first of all, what is the jet stream? So the jet stream is, so first of all, there are several of them on Earth, and it's a fast current in the upper atmosphere. And most of you have flown across the Atlantic You have probably experienced it at some point, because that's the current of air that planes use to get from the US to Europe faster, and they try to avoid it when they go from Europe to the US. On Earth, there are kind of there are three main types of jet streams. Slightly different processes drive them. But the one I was investigating was the mid-latitude jet stream, which arises from the fact that you have north to south temperature gradient. And whenever you have a temperature gradient in the atmosphere, you will get winds. So this kind of current of air arises because of this north-south temperature gradient. And this current of air is important because as it wiggles or meanders, it forms windstorms. And this is what people refer to these windstorms as eddies or waves or storms. These windstorms are the major transporter of heat and moisture and momentum in the global atmosphere. So, the amount of warming you get in the Arctic is related to these storms. The amount of heating we get in Western Europe is related to these storms. It was exciting to study this phenomenon in the UK because, of course, every January, February, we get a series of these storms. So I was always watching all of my different apps. Everyone else was always grumpy. Oh, another storm, more rain. And I was always watching, trying to see how it develops. So yeah, that was fun.
Where I live, we had a huge impact from the storms because there's so much flooding up in the north. So, I mean,
yeah, that's a very important point. These storms are also a major cause of extreme weather in Western Europe. So yeah, being able to predict them is very, very important. And I think that's one of the reasons why I got the fellowship funding, because it's very much recognized that the more we know about these storms, the better we can predict them and avoid their impact.
Yeah. So sorry.
I wasn't sure if you wanted to know about storm. So I just wanted to add that you mentioned storm tracks. So in my particular case, a storm track is the region where storms occur most frequently. So when you hear storm track on the news, you imagine like the actual path of a storm or a hurricane. But in this case, it kind of has, in atmospheric sciences, storm track kind of have two meanings, and I'm kind of studying the storm track, which is the kind of statistical feature of the atmosphere. So it's the zone where storms occur most frequently, if you like.
So what is your model, your two-variable model, with the structure of a nonlinear oscillator that describes the interaction between local baroclinicity, and you'll have to explain what this is first, and eddy heat flux, in order to understand aspects of the variance in storm tracks?
So this is related to what we've just been talking about. So baroclinicity is you could think of it as as being proportional to the north-south temperature gradient. And the north-south temperature gradient not only gives rise to these fast winds above, but it also, the stronger this temperature gradient is, the more likely you will get meandering in the jet stream, and therefore you get more storms. So it can be shown theoretically that these storms have a kind of theoretical expression for their growth rate, and in that expression you see there's a north-south temperature gradient, and there are some other factors, but the main kind of factor is the north-south temperature gradient. And so that's related to barochronicity. So barochronicity could be seen as the growth rate of these storms. And so we developed a very simple toy model which describes how this barochronicity, or the growth rate of these storms, how it varies with relation to the actual intensity of the storms. Mm. So, and the intensity of these storms can be measured by, for example, heat fluxes. Mm-hmm. So as the stronger the storm, the more heat it's fluxing, the more heat it's transporting poleward. And so we developed this kind of two-dimensional model which describes this behavior. And maybe the best way of describing it is by using an analogy of the predator-prey model, the Lotka-Volterra equations. I don't know if you're familiar with them. You said you did some biology-related podcasts as well. But the basic principle is that you have some level of growth rate, so barochronicity, and that then starts generating eddies. And this barochronicity is basically being replenished by solar forcing. So you get, more heating at the equator and cooling at the poles. Mm-hmm. So there's always some this forcing trying to replenish the barochronicity or the temperature gradients. So there's solar forcing trying to maintain the temperature gradients, and these temperature gradients keep increasing and increasing until it gets to a point where it triggers these storms. And these storms are usually triggered in a kind of like explosive way. It's like a burst of activity. And as these storms grow, they mix the atmosphere and they decrease the temperature gradients. So then the barochronicity drops. So it's similar to having a predator eating its prey. So the prey keeps kind of increasing steadily until some threshold beyond at which it can support some predator population, and then the predators will start thriving and then eating all of the prey, at which point the prey then vanishes. So the predator population then drops as well. And then this kind of, and when the predator population drops, then the prey can start, growing again. So, so you basically get a cyclic behavior in the predator-prey system, just like you do in the storm track and the barochronicity system. And we measured that this cycling is approximately has an approximately 30-day period. So every 30 days you get this kind of burst in activity in storms, and then it just decreases again and waits for the temperature gradients to replenish. So that was a large part of my PhD.
Wonderful. And that will be so beneficial to so many communities, especially coastal communities around the world.
Yes, hopefully. Yes, so there is, I think we showed that there may be some predictive power, since there's this 30-day cycling, but it's quasi-periodic, which means that it's kind of approximately periodic. So there are other factors that kind of control when exactly these bursts of storms happen. But there may be precursors which this model can kind of point out, where you can you are more likely to get this period of bursts of activity, and therefore lots of storms coming at the UK or Western Europe at once. So yeah.
Okay, so can you tell us a bit about your work on the Antarctic circumpolar current and how this has an impact on ocean stratification, heat content and carbon content?
Mm-hmm. So this was a collaboration with an ocean team in Oxford. This work was an extension or an application of this model I've just described, but for the oceans, in a slightly different way. So if you were to average a very simple model in time, then you will get a prediction that about the dynamics of the ocean. So just to kind of define some of the things you just mentioned. So the Antarctic Circumpolar current, that's, you could think of it as a jet stream in the ocean, which encircles Antarctica. So it's a large scale current around Antarctica. And just like the jet stream in the atmosphere, this current meanders, and the meanders are eddies. And so even though it's a different system, it's still fluid on a rotating planet, which is affected by temperature and salinity differences. And so it has a similar type of instability. So this is an example of how you can use a theory from one discipline and apply it in the other, because the two disciplines are closely related. And so the prediction of this model was that the jet stream strength, which is related to the temperature gradients, therefore the barochronicity, is when it's time averaged, is proportional to the you could say eddy friction. So it's not the eddies, or it's not this. Let's call them ocean eddies. It's not the eddies that are proportional to their own friction. It's the current. It's the jet stream, if you like. And whereas the eddies themselves are proportional to the wind aloft, which kind of supplies momentum to the current, to the jet stream. So it's kind of counterintuitive. You would have thought that if you apply friction to the eddies, you will decrease the eddies. And if you supply more kind of push from the winds from above, from the atmosphere to the ocean, then you will increase the flow in the ocean. So that's what you would have thought intuitively, but that's not the case. It's this model showed or predicted that it's actually the eddy friction that controls the current in the atmosphere, the kind of jet stream, and the eddies themselves are controlled by the forcing from the atmospheric winds. And so this was used to justify an already observed mechanism in the ocean, which is called eddy saturation. And that means that eddies are to some extent insensitive to their own friction, and they can only be increased if you change the if you change the wind forcing, if you like, the wind stress forcing from the atmosphere. So this has been a kind of you could say conundrum in the atmosphere, in the oceanic community, who have noticed this in models and didn't know how to explain it theoretically. So our model gave them a kind of theoretical basis for this observation.
So how did this suggest an unexpected and important impact of eddy energy dissipation through bottom drag or lee wave generation on ocean stratification, ocean heat content, and potentially atmospheric CO2?
So the bottom drag and the lee wave generation are related to, I guess I called it eddy friction, but it's basically anything that dissipates that, that you use to dissipate the energy of the eddies. So there was this kind of counterintuitive behavior and we gave it, we kind of formalized it using this model. And so it showed how eddies are sensitive to wind stress, but not as sensitive to this, bottom drag or Leo generation or anything that's dissipating the eddy energy. And this is important for ocean stratification and heat transport, and even CO2 storage, because the eddies, the primary kind of effect of eddies is to mix stuff, right? So whenever you have a storm or a kind of wave in the in a fluid, it mixes the fluid, so it makes it more homogeneous. And so the more eddies you have, the less stratification you bound to have. So the less you will decrease both the horizontal and the vertical gradients. So stratification is basically the larger the vertical density gradients, the more stratification you have. So so the eddies basically mix everything. And same goes for, I think you mentioned, atmospheric CO2 uptake by the ocean. So the ocean absorbs CO2 from the atmosphere it's at a very slow rate, and slowly it kind of the CO2 is mixed into the bottom kind of layers of the ocean. But this is a very, very slow process. But if you have eddies present, then it speeds it up by some factor. But yes, so the average behavior of the eddies can also affect the efficiency at which the ocean can absorb CO2 from the atmosphere, which of course then impacts the global temperatures, and that then impacts the global winds, and then the global winds then impact the ocean. So it's all very related, and that's why the climate system is so complicated. It's because there's so many of these dependencies.
Absolutely, it's a huge feedback loop.
Yes.
Yeah. So to finish off, what would you like to see implemented in the future for climate action? And how can we all do our bit in tackling this huge ongoing problem that we face today?
Mm-hmm. So I would say that we're already seeing a huge investment in renewable energy. There's a lot of, recently it's been announced that, say, in the US, there's going to be $2.3 trillion for, it's not just for climate related infrastructure, but that's a huge part of it. So it's great to see that there will be investment in this area, increasing the or giving incentives for people to buy electric cars, to implement more solar panels, have more wind power onshore and offshore. There are also, especially in California, is quite environment conscious. So there are lots of schemes which involve carbon trading, and there is some sort of push for corporate responsibility, so that huge corporations have to kind of, well, I think in New Zealand, there was an article the other day that in New Zealand they are for the first time they are requiring financial institutions to report their kind of climate impact, some sort of climate impact metric. I don't know exactly what that involves, but it's good to know that countries are thinking about this sort of thing. So more of that, and more I guess I'm a little bit sometimes these metrics of climate impact can be a little bit ambiguous, and I think if it's not done correctly, then it just adds more ammunition to people who are skeptical. So I think the action should be there, but it should be more informed. and that also involves more kind of more research. So more research into finding out what the threats are, how likely they are, and where they are more likely. That will lead to more targeted action. So
that's why your work is so
more funding for us, yay.
Absolutely, your work is amazing, and it will be really important for us in the future, and it's really important for people to hear about it and to understand about it and to talk about it. So thank you so much for joining us today and for telling us all about your work. It's been really fascinating and I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, Martha. Same here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for listening.